The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Raynard Sanders explains how charter schools are bringing back racial segregation. Political scientist Eric Schickler calls on progressive Democrats to embrace racial justice. And Bill Press talked with Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer about his battle to legalize marijuana. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. Scholar and author Raynard Sanders has committed his career to equity in education. In a new book, he explains how that vision is being set back and why charter schools are to blame. And we say hello to Raynard Sanders, who's had over 30 years of experience in teaching, educational administration, and economic and community development. Based in New Orleans, he's the president at Innovative Community Development Systems and co-author of a new book titled 21st Century Jim Crow Schools, The Impact of Charters on Public Education. Raynard Sanders, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, and the pleasure is ours. With such a long history in public education, including serving as a high school principal in New Orleans, why did you feel it was important to write this book now?
Well, first off, let me say it was overdue. And it should have been written probably about maybe 10 years ago. But the full story had not been told yet. We knew that there was something wrong with what was going on in New Orleans, but it had not fleshed itself out yet, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But the reason why, I wrote this book was because New Orleans has been labeled as the perfect way to reform urban school districts. And across this country, urban school districts, I guess there's have a tag on them of being the worst school districts in the country that serves a large minority and poor people, and how they struggle for a lot of different kinds of reasons. So in 2005, as you well know, and everyone else, we had a watershed event called Hurricane Katrina. And Katrina gave the city the chance to start over. We were the first city in America to have a mandatory evacuation. We depopulated the city. We lost our tax base in about 3 hours. Everything was totally devastating. So the question became, as you restart it, will you be able to restart it, number one, and include everyone? And also restart it and eliminate the systemic issues that you had in New Orleans, which every community had. Okay? So while people in New Orleans were still underwater, struggling to find out where their loved ones was, lost their homes, many of them lost jobs, unbeknownst to us, the Heritage Foundation met, and I believe it was September the 12th. And they basically set the agenda on how to return the communities from the Gulf Coast. And that agenda was sent to Congress, and under George W. Bush, they basically followed that agenda. One of the bullets in there was to eliminate public schools and to create more charter, private/voucher schools. And that's what came down. And also what came down was they saw this as an opportunity for entrepreneurism. And so we began to go through a lot of changes within our major governance system where a lot of monies came in for recovery, but along with those monies came opportunity. And in the public school system, the state officials quickly embraced the idea of not reopening schools in New Orleans right after Katrina at all. And when they would reopen, they were going to reopen at charter schools. And the whole paradigm began to change such that elected boards were not any good anymore. Professionally trained teachers were not any good anymore. Neighborhood schools were not any good anymore. Having smaller class size, doing things that follow best practices was not any good anymore. And the other thing was that it had to be started in an entrepreneur spirit with an entrepreneur involved. So we made a major change in the way that we deliver public education. And what that turned out to be, under the guise of charter schools, and all in the name of reform, that we created our schools into profit centers with non-professional people, mostly outsiders. We literally fired 7,500 employees, killed the middle class because a significant of them were the black middle class, a significant of them was African American. And we lost 7,500 livable wage jobs. And there was no outcry from the political community to say, look, we know our school district is bad, but you got to keep our people. These are my people. Right. And those teachers, counselors, principals were summarily fired. And then we begin to see a deluge of money coming into the system. And as I mentioned earlier, this whole paradigm shift began to change. And New Orleans was on a road here where we were going to give out these charter licenses to anybody. You didn't even have to have any experience. You didn't have to have any training. You could have been a used car salesman. And if you came in and you presented yourself, and you were not from New Orleans particularly, and if you were not white, if you were non-black, then a lot of folks got charged. So we opened up these schools and flipped them and began to turn a lot of them into charters. Initially, we ran them as district schools, and the whole state, the whole school board, they took away all of these schools, illegally changed the takeover policy, and the state became in charge, and they just flipped everything. And then they began to market themselves as the way to turn around urban school districts and create the 21st century cities. Now, for the last, not this particular presidential campaign, but the previous two, New Orleans was mentioned in both of those campaigns as what we should be doing in America. Now, when all of that was happening in 2008 and we were reading all this stuff about how great it was, the children and the citizens of New Orleans were suffering. They were disenfranchised because the charter boards were appointed and they were not elected. They didn't have any neighborhood schools anymore. The boards controlled everything, these charter boards with unquestionable authority. And they were making tons and tons and tons of money. So this story in New Orleans, the story in Chicago, and also the story in New York, that all played out differently, is very, very important. Because what we have here, we have some folks with a totally different agenda that is not good for this country, that is attacking urban school districts under the guise of a charter school, which by original definition is a great thing to do. But they don't do anything by that original definition. And what you find them to be are charter schools that offer two different types of education. You have some charter schools here that have admission requirements, And those kids receive a wonderful education in about 5 or 6 schools and 7 schools. And everybody tries to get their kids. New Orleans is an African-American student population that is about 92% Black. And those kids are put in schools with substandard teachers, and many of them are in a no-excuse model where they're in a militarized school where they have to walk on lines, and basically the children are being taught to be compliant rather than to learn subject matter. And so go ahead.
Well, there's something else that your book documents, and that's some of the destructive consequences of charter school expansion. And among them is the displacement of African-American teachers.
Oh, yeah.
Which obviously is going to play a role in what you're talking about. How does this happen?
Well, in New Orleans, it was very easy to happen. In Chicago and Detroit, Chicago and New York, they have gradually replaced teachers with non-professional teachers, mostly from alternative programs like Teach for America. But in New Orleans, it was in one swoop. Because what happened was, when the state took away all of the schools and the schools didn't open, right, then the employees who was employed by the locally elected board did not have any money to keep them going and to keep them on, right? So they went through a process. Well, they went through a process and dismissed them, but they didn't follow the exact process to dismiss them. But the realities is that they all were dismissed. And the school district pre-Katrina, which at one time had 123 schools, 119 schools, now only had about 17 schools. And they could not reemploy those people. And the state that eventually came in and reopened schools in March of 2006, they stated up front that they did not want the teachers from New Orleans. And that even though if they were tenured or whatever, they made those teachers take a test to come back to work.
We're speaking with Raynard Sanders, who's got over 30 years of experience in teaching, educational administration, economic and community development. And he co-authored this new book called 21st Century Jim Crow Schools, The Impact of Charters on Public Education. Now, Raynard, I think it's fair to point out that charter schools started with a promise of education equity, and obviously that all turned around and went the opposite direction. In addition to the impact of charter schools on African-American teachers, which we just discussed, what else has this movement meant for African-American students?
Well, what it meant was that if you are not gifted and talented academically or musically and don't get into a few of the schools, you're generally in schools that have inexperienced teachers and are managed by boards who do not have an agenda for educating the children there. So the children really have lost a great deal by sitting in a classroom, for instance, in an Algebra 1 class with a teacher who just graduated in May and it's September, and the teacher went through 6 weeks of training and she has a degree in vocal music. So that's where the suffering began. But then it goes even further than that, because what we find in the schools that serve as mostly minority and poor kids that didn't get into the few schools where the gifted and talented are, we found a resurrection of equity and access issues. And we found that some schools refuse to service special needs kids and refuse to admit them. And that evolved into a class action lawsuit, which was settled in 2014. And the state refused to force the charter schools, and they were in charge of them at that time, to implement the federal law. So you saw that going on. You also saw suspension and expulsion rates go off the roof. So they were 10 times the national average. Then we had reports of students being locked in closets. We had reports of them sending home kids, not notifying the parents, kids wandering the street all day, not writing it up as a suspension. And we saw a chronic academic failure that was going on with those schools. So the children have suffered the most. And, we're going into about the 12th year, maybe the 13th year, I think. Well, the 12th year this year. And so they really have had those kids under their jurisdiction now for a whole K-12 experience. And, they have the lowest CT scores. They have the lowest scores on a national test called a NAEP. And we have transcripts being tampered with, and they're sending kids off to school with telling the university that they've taken courses that they have not taken. It has been an abundance of problems that has really, really stifled public education here in New Orleans. So they come in this Trojan horse, as if we are the charter schools and we're going to help the kids with the worst need. And they end up not helping the kids with the worst need and creating a tiered school system much more structured than we had pre-Katrina, where we had a small amount of kids receiving a good education, and we have a majority of the kids that are put in some horrible conditions.
They come in to take the opportunity to start over, as you pointed out when we first started having this discussion, and have made it what seems to me just, 10 times worse. It's nonsensical to me that happens.
Yeah. And I do need to say that this is not while it has all of the conservative kind of characteristics, this has been a bipartisan movement. Mm-hmm. So we do have Democrats that support this, as we have Republicans that support this, right? And, I think which is the biggest thing out of all of it is that it has removed democracy. Because now in New Orleans, we have no public participation in the public schools because the public schools are managed by charter boards who are all self-appointed.
Oh my
goodness. They also operate in a realm of not being accountable to the public, talking to parents any kind of way, doing kids just about anything that they want to do. And the state let them operate that way. And even today, they operate with unquestionable accountability. They operate they're being returned to the school board now under a legislative bill that says that they control everything, and only with their approval can the school board interfere in the daily operations or say something about it. So it is madness. But the removal of democracy, in the last election, they were talking about suppression of the vote. Well, this movement that we have here in New Orleans and that spread across the country is the removal of the vote. And it's not a suppression of the vote because they have removed the public from the public education process.
Right. Just absolutely abolished it.
Many
of us know the experience of being a parent and trying to find the right schools for our children. Raynard, can parents even trust what they read about charter schools?
No. I talked earlier about the monies that came in. Right. Tons of philanthropic organizations begin to give money here in New Orleans to help to rebuild the schools. Many of them were very conservative and had really an agenda to eliminate the public and to make this whole thing private, such that we have some charter schools, about 5 or 6 of them, in addition to the state and local money that they were getting. They were receiving as much as $2 and $3 million a year to help fund this whole operation. So it is controlled by two groups of people. Number one is people that are interested in offering an inadequate, underfunded education to poor minority kids. And that has always existed in America. Pre the Brown case and post the Brown case, when you look at it across the country, we find how communities found ways not to take care of the kids that needed the most help. That's who it's first driven by. The second group is driven by is the fact that now the schools have been monetized. With that being said, we have hedge fund operators, and we also have folks that are utilizing new market tax credits to pump into the charter system, and they have learned how to make money off of it. So we are in a very terrible situation in the fact that our kids in New Orleans and across the country are not only not being educated, but they're like commodities. And there's no concern about dropout rates. They mislead the public about that. They mislead them about a lot of information. So if you are moving to New Orleans or moving to cities where this movement has grabbed a hold of, it is very, very difficult to find a school. You have to swim through the information and validate the information. They have a very well-organized PR campaign, beautiful websites with Black children on them, talking about how they're helping Black children and stuff. But you really have to dig deeper, not believe what you hear, and validate all the information that comes to you. And then you got to find a school, that's suitable for your child. And in New Orleans, that is more than a notion.
Wow. Before we let you go, as I mentioned before, charter schools started with a promise of education equity. Can you imagine a way in which charter schools can return to their original promise?
Yes, I can. And what we need to do is to organize in communities on behalf of the future of those communities, begin putting pressure on local lawmakers and state lawmakers to do several things. Number one is put the public back in charge of public education. Do not let these charter schools operate with self-appointed boards. Create an accountability system that includes all of the tenets of the original charter school model. And the big thing is that you follow state and federal law and that you take the profit out of it. And you do not allow people run these charter schools that are making $400,000 a year. We have a charter school principal, elementary school here, that is a failing school of 300 kids. That principal of that charter school makes more money than the superintendent in St. Tammany Parish, which is the highest rated school district in the state, and he has 37,000 kids. So you've got to take the profit out of it, and you've got to make them follow the law. And most importantly, you cannot ever remove democracy and have a situation where literally people can set up schools that are predominantly white. And eliminate the African-American community. So we have to get back to those kinds of laws, and we have to get back to best practices, and all of this hiring people who are not trained, lying to those young Teach for America people, telling them how they come in to help and then sending them out there to the wolves. We can't do that, and we got to realize that our most precious public service, the most important public service, is public education. And the way that we're going to be judged in history is how well we treat those kids that need the most help.
The name of the book, 21st Century Jim Crow Schools, The Impact of Charters on Public Education. The co-author, Raynard Sanders, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Raynard, we appreciate your time with us today, and we look forward to having you back again with us soon. And hopefully what we'll be talking about is a turnaround to the charter schools and the entire school system.
Yes, I hope so. In ways, and also talk about ways that here's some success stories that's helping to fight this, disaster capitalism that's taken over our country.
Absolutely. Raynard, thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, political scientist Eric Schickler debunks the myth that identity politics is bad for Democrats. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
President Trump is said to see himself as a sort of Teddy Roosevelt. TR, however, was known as a trust buster, while DT has become known as a trust hugger. We recently saw the hugger in action when he held a PR event to ballyhoo 50 proposals to stop Big Pharma from gouging American consumers with monopolistic drug pricing. People are rightly outraged that pill-peddling giants exploit patients who have life-threatening diseases and routinely jack up prices on common drugs by some 10% a year. As a presidential candidate, Trump jumped on this hot issue, accusing drug makers of, quote, getting away with murder. So now, with typical modesty, he has revealed his plan to stop the rip-offs, calling his 50 proposals the, quote, most sweeping action in history to lower the price of prescription drugs for the American people. Yeah, sweeping, as in sweeping the problem under the White House rug. 50 is just a political number meant to puff up Trump's plan as something big. But as one congressional Democrat pointed out, all 50 amount to, quote, a sugar-coated nothing pill. It even fails to include his own campaign promise to use the purchasing power of Medicare to negotiate lower prices for seniors. Far from feeling punished, Big Pharma itself felt it had gotten a warm presidential hug. Drug company stock prices went up immediately after the presidential speech. This is Jim Hightower saying, it's really no surprise that Trump is letting these corporate profiteers continue getting away with murder. After all, political posturing aside, he has stacked his administration with drug industry executives like Alex Azar, a former Eli Lilly honcho who is now his Secretary of Health. How revealing that Azar was standing right behind the president at the White House media event, beaming and applauding as Trump announced, well, a lot of nothing.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Eric Schickler is a political scientist who writes about party politics. He says that racial justice energized the Democratic Party in the past and can do so again today. And we say hello to Eric Schickler, Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of Racial Realignment, The Transformation of American Liberalism. Eric Schickler, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure to be here.
And ours to have you with us. In a recent article in The Nation titled Debunking the Myth That Identity Politics is Bad for the Democratic Party, You challenge a line of thinking that the party's commitment to racial equality has alienated it from the white working class. Taking the other side for a moment, how does that argument play out?
Yeah, well, I think the argument that's been made is essentially that the Democratic Party and liberalism was strongest when it was framed as this universalistic program that was focused on, the needs of the working and middle classes as a whole, and not paying any particular attention to the interests of, for example, racial minorities. So, and I think implicit in this is the idea that, when the beneficiaries of what the Democrats were doing, what liberalism was doing, were basically white workers, then the program was strong politically. And I take issue with that argument.
Mm-hmm. Now, in making your argument, you invite us to go back to the late 1930s, a time when, in your words, New Deal liberals recognized that, quote, without racial justice, there would be no program of economic equality, close quote. How did those New Dealers understand racial justice, and what was their impact at the ballot box?
Yeah, well, I think this is really kind of the critical moment in a lot of ways, is this point in the mid-1930s. And so where this kind of conventional view of the New Deal sees it as essentially, a program for white workers from which African Americans were excluded, what I argue in the book is, while it is true that particularly the early New Deal programs did include discrimination against African Americans, very soon after that first kind of set of programs, you got an entry onto the scene of a new kind of liberalism brought really with the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations unions, and the entry alongside that of African Americans into the Democratic Party. And what the CIO saw essentially is that the interests of workers and the interests of African Americans could be seen as aligned with one another. That for the union movement to really succeed, it needed to incorporate African Americans, and as a result, it needed to actually pay attention to questions of racial justice. And so, what the CIO saw essentially is that the forces of conservatism in America were really relying on dividing people by race, by ethnicity, so that they wouldn't recognize their common interests.
And the CIO, who made up the CIO? I mean, and that role was obviously very important. Speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So this was really the rise of industrial unionism. Before the CIO, labor unions in the U.S., for the most part, were dominated by craft-based unions, the old American Federation of Labor, that really relied on essentially excluding workers, excluding competition. And so they would often, explicitly discriminate against African Americans. And what the CIO did, starting with the United Mine Workers and then the United Auto Workers and the Steel Workers, is try to organize these big industrial workplaces. And in that context, what they saw essentially is that if you exclude people based on race, those individuals are going to have become potential strike breakers. And so instead, what they tried to do is create a much more broad, inclusive union movement. And I think this was both because of pragmatic interest. They saw this as good for the union, but also kind of principled interest. A lot of these industrial union organizers came out of left-wing movements that themselves saw racial justice as really part of their goal of economic justice.
We're speaking with Eric Schickler, Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott, professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of Racial Realignment, The Transformation of American Liberalism. Eric, how should we understand the backlash to this connection between racial justices and economic liberalism as it emerged in the 1930s?
Yeah, so really what happens in the 1930s is Southern Democrats, conservative Southern Democrats, who had always been the backbone of the Democratic Party, they saw the entry of the CIO and the entry of African Americans as a threat to the Jim Crow system of white supremacy in the South. They realized that the CIO's goal of organizing workers in the South was going to threaten the low-wage economy they were relying on, and in particular, their willingness to organize African Americans would simultaneously threaten the system of white supremacy. So the Southern Democrats turn on the New Deal by the late 1930s and really become seen as the enemies of the expansion of the kind of liberal welfare state. And so this is really a kind of key moment in American politics. If you think about where liberalism first runs into a major obstacle, it's that what happened in the late 1930s is these Southern Democrats joined forces with Republicans to attack labor unions, which had become the kind of core, set of activists and votes and money for this New Deal liberal coalition.
How do you see that kind of backlash playing out today?
Yeah, so one of the key points I try to make in the article is again this idea of backlash against racial liberalism, that it starts much earlier, and from the beginning it was linked to this kind of anti-labor kind of cause. And so one of the things that I think some of the critics of so-called identity politics get wrong is the assumption that, well, if liberals had just focused on workers and not thought about racial issues, well, then the liberal project could be much more successful. We wouldn't have had that backlash. And what I argue in the article, and also in more depth in the book, is that this kind of conservative resistance to change goes back much further and is much more deeply entrenched in our politics. So if we think about what's going on today or in recent decades, one way that I would think about it is that it's wrong to focus so much on the racial backlash in isolation, because and see that as the key to the rise of republicanism. It's an important part of the story, don't get me wrong, but an equally important part is this attack on labor unions that starts in the late 1930s, and you get the Taft-Hartley Act, which allows for right-to-work states, and a number of other anti-labor initiatives, and that really undercuts a big part of this liberal coalition and makes it much harder to, for example, keep white workers on board with this kind of dual agenda of racial and economic justice. So in other words, the attack on unions and labor happens well before the 1960s, and that's really weakening liberalism, really, one of its key foundations from the start.
We often talk about how the slow, sudden, or the slow decline of labor unions, we refer to it as all starting in the 60s. Did it actually start in the 30s? Did we actually start to, once it was up and then it all of a sudden started to decline that way?
Well, so the numbers kept going up for a little while after that, but the political attack starts in the late 1930s and starts to get important legislation, especially in 1947 with Taft-Hartley. And, Taft-Hartley doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a 10-year process of Southern Democrats and Republicans kind of building a coalition to try to attack, this foundation of liberalism. And that attack, that stems from this early, this sense that what the CIO and labor is doing at this time is really pushing for a kind of radical refashioning of American politics and society in a direction, that I think many of us would see as one that's promoting both economic and racial justice.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving forward, and of course we often talk about learn from history. What are the lessons you want Democrats to draw from history?
So I think the one of the key lessons is that Democrats need to see that, first of all, it's not the case that inherently, the cause that they should separate out, either you appeal to class and workers or you appeal to questions of racial justice. So I think the way the debate's posed now is essentially identity politics versus class politics, right? And I think that when liberalism was at its strongest, the idea was that there was a coherent program that linked together these different interests. So on the one hand, thinking about the broadly shared interests of workers regardless of race, yet at the same time recognizing that there are particular problems and issues that disproportionately affect racial minorities. Today, African Americans, Latinos, think about gender as well, obviously, and that figuring out a program and a vision of politics that stitches together these into common interests. Thinks about, instead of saying, okay, here's our item for African Americans. Here's an item for Latinos. Here's an item for women. Here's an item for gays and lesbians. But instead to think about, hey, what are the common enemies faced by all of these groups? And what is a kind of policy vision or ideological vision that shows people, persuades people why their particular interests are served, by pursuing this kind of broader agenda. And so, like, what was so powerful about the CIO was this argument that to achieve economic justice, they had to pay attention to the problems facing African Americans. And I think that liberalism needs to find ways to try to recapture that kind of inclusive vision that's attentive to these different identities at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And you recently participated in a conference of political scientists titled Parties and Partisanship in the Era of Twitter and Trump. What are some of the important ideas that came out of that event? Sure.
Well, I think that one of the ideas that came out of the event is the question of how are parties going to function in an era where, to a large extent, they've lost credibility with their own voters. If you think about the rise of Donald Trump in the Republican Party, what's most striking is how, all of the party's elites, did not, hated Trump, did not want him to be the nominee, and, try to send signals to the voters, this is not our person, and yet he won anyway. And I think you can see, at least, it's not quite as stark, but I think even with the Democrats, with Bernie Sanders, vast majority of party leaders did not want Sanders to be the nominee, and yet an awful lot of Democratic voters, chose him. And so, and this is really a kind of different world where party leaders themselves, I think, have lost a lot of credibility with their voters, and as a result, you can get these insurgent outsider candidates who are much more successful, and I think that poses a big problem or challenge for the party system. If we usually think about parties as kind of winnowing a field of selecting leaders who will be, ready to work collaboratively, work with other partisans in Washington, that's kind of broken down now. And I think the reason it's broken down, though, is, I don't think it's the fault of voters per se. It's a disconnect, the fact that the leadership of the parties are not seen as credible by their own voters in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Which is their own fault, I would.
Yeah,
really,
one could certainly. Yeah, one could certainly argue. I mean, certainly on the Republican side, voters had been given a set of promises, and over a number of years, and elect a Republican Congress, and will do this and that, and didn't actually correspond to what happened, and so I think it's pretty clear they lost faith with those leaders.
Mm-hmm. Eric Schickler, Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott, professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. He is the author of Racial Realignment, The Transformation of American Liberalism. Eric, we appreciate your time with us today, and hopefully you can come back and join us again soon.
Okay, great. Thanks. My pleasure. Enjoyed talking with you as well.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer on his prediction that marijuana will become legal in the United States.
It is T-shirt day here at the Bill Press Show. I've got mine, Enemy of the American People, and our guest, Congressman Earl Blumenauer from the state of Oregon, with a team red, white, and blue Blumenauer. Red, white, and blue Blumenauer.
I like it.
I like it. Is that your campaign T-shirt?
That's the office running T-shirt, which last week we won the CAP Challenge. Our team victorious again.
Oh, whoa.
So we'll take victories where we can find them, Bill.
You must work them. You work them out and get ready for that race, huh?
Well, we do recruit based on their 10K times.
Oh, that's what it is, a 10K right here in the district?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cap
All right.
Challenge.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is it just House or House and Senate?
It is House, Senate, the judiciary, the media. Every year there are teams competing.
Yeah, and I understand Chuck Grassley used to have a pretty good team, no?
He was a runner, or maybe still is.
Yeah.
Dick Lugar ran it for like 30 consecutive years.
Did he really?
Yeah, it's a fun event.
Right. Oh, yeah, I think Grassley for a while used to run, maybe he still does, to the office every day, his Senate office. Takes a shower and then
hit the street.
Senate Judiciary.
Yep.
Yeah, right. We've been here for a little bit this morning, Congressman, generating a few comments here, Peter.
We're on Twitter at BP Show.
Before
at
we get
BP
into the things we
Show.
want to talk to you about, yes.
KG weighing in saying, Bill, you're rocking that shirt, looking good.
All
yes,
right.
your enemy of the people shirt, looking great. On Donald Trump and his phone, saying it's too inconvenient. Resistant Stevie says, even if Trump's phone was hacked, there would be nothing on it except for the ravings of a lunatic. He conducts no business there on that phone, so it doesn't really sound like it's a
problem,
real compromising position. Susan says, I've been up since dark 30 in California listening to my favorite enemy of the people, Bill Press, of course, in reference to your shirt. And
special shout out, Congressman Wright, to our friends on the West Coast who are up early watching
really
you
dedicated.
and me and listening. Yeah, that's
our people.
Our people.
Our
right.
people.
Our
And one
people.
final comment from Walter Ogden, who says Donald Trump and the rule of law stated together. Talk about an oxymoron. If you have a comment, find us on Twitter at BP Show.
You know, I know this is not something we planned to talk about, but I have to ask you again. There's so much talk about the sanctity of our election system these days as we come up to 2018. Oregon has done it by mail, exclusively by mail. I forget for how long now.
20 years.
20 years. And working, not working?
Well, first of all, we don't have to worry about hanging Chad.
Right.
Second, there's an opportunity because the election day is 440 hours long. There's an opportunity for people to process and be able to get information late breaking or early. It is less expensive than maintaining individual polling places.
Really?
So
really? Yeah.
So people can devote their resources to election administration.
Do they pay for their own stamps? Or
Yep.
It's not
No, you
have to put a stamp on.
Put a stamp on yourself.
Yeah, okay.
Relatively small price to pay, which is probably less than it would cost for gasoline to drive to a polling place.
Sure.
You do it in the comfort of your own home, and it is secure. There is a record that you can go back and trace if there's any question about the election outcome. Unlike what's happening, as you know, with 3,000 different election systems around the country, county by county, some administered by partisan officials. This is pretty secure, pretty safe, efficient, and we like it.
Yeah. Oh, I hope more. Have any other states?
More and more states are moving in this direction.
Yeah.
Some have permanent absentee systems, but people recognize that the mail-in ballot is secure, it's convenient, and less expensive.
Right. We take advantage of the permanent absentee. Carol and I do the permanent absentee here in California in order to continue to vote in California. In fact, I have my ballot at home that I've been working through. There's several initiatives I don't really quite understand.
California tradition, which we gave you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, Oregonians are also always complaining about Californians moving north, right? So we'll take some ideas moving south from Oregon. Congressman, you've been active on many fronts. This is National Bike Month, which I know is a big issue for you, and you've made a big difference. These bike paths down Pennsylvania Avenue here in Washington, D.C., Earl Blumenauer, they ought to have your name on them, right? More and more, I see more and more people riding bikes to work here. Is that true across the country?
It is true across the country. There is an effort in cities large and small to be able to enable people to burn calories instead of fossil fuel. There are amazing things that have been going on. For example, even in Los Angeles, New York City, we're very proud of what we've done in Portland, but where you have bike share, where you're seeing electric bikes. I mean, there's a revolution taking place. Hopefully, we can continue making it safe and secure for our kids. And it adds a component to livability, which is so important in our communities.
It seems to be that there are more and more innovations, as you point out. So we started with these bike shares, which was a huge thing and very successful here in Washington and other cities. And now in Washington, you have these bikes that you don't have to go to a bike share spot. They're just bikes.
Yep.
What do you call them?
A dockless bike.
Dockless bikes. Yeah, leave the bike wherever you are. And,
well, it's part
and
of,
they're brightly colored. You can spot them, and people find them. And,
well, it's part of an effort to give people more choices. The dockless bikes, bike share.
And now the electric
bikes are taking off. There was a great experiment in San Francisco this last month where they introduce bike share with e-bikes, electric bikes that have been phenomenally popular. But we're seeing car share. We're seeing car to go. We're seeing opportunities to give people more choices to make the transportation experience seamless and not have somebody captive to their own vehicle that doesn't move 22 and a half hours a day. It's extraordinarily expensive. These are cheaper, more convenient, and less damaging to the environment.
Yeah, I have several friends who use car to go, and you see these little cars to go all over Washington now, right?
Yep, all over the country.
They use up like maybe half a parking spot.
And it's there when you want it.
It's there, there when you want it. The other thing that you've been way out in front on, I want to get to the Farm Bill in just a second, but first of all, you are a member of the Pot Caucus in the United States Capitol.
Cannabis Caucus.
Cannabis,
yes,
I'm sorry.
Sir.
I knew it wasn't marijuana, but Cannabis Caucus. Any progress on that front? I mean,
absolutely. When we started moving aggressively in the course of the last 6 years, exploded. Now, I first voted to decriminalize marijuana when Oregon was the first state to decriminalize in 1973. So I've been doing this for decades.
Whoa! But
we ran into the Nixon war on drugs, the Reagan Just Say No. We had 20 years in the wilderness of repression, unequal application of the law, especially against African American young men. But California helped us get started again in 1996 with the initiative on medical marijuana. And since then, we now have 30 states that have approved adult use, 29 by a vote of the people. It's on the ballot again in Michigan, Minnesota. Utah is going to vote on medical. This is a huge issue that's cresting. And I predict, especially if the Democrats take control of the House, that this will be all over in a couple of years, that the politicians will finally catch up with where the people are, demanding that we end this failed prohibition on marijuana.
And so that end result you see would be the legalization of the recreational use of marijuana?
What I think it means is, first of all, and will happen quickly, will enable these state legal businesses to have bank accounts, which it's very difficult for them to have.
Even in states that have legalized now, right?
Tax them fairly. They can't deduct their business expenses. Outrageous. The federal government stops research on cannabis. But I think the barriers will fall. We will enable our veterans in the Veterans Administration to have access to medical marijuana, which can be transformative. And I think within the next 2 or 3 years, it won't be listed at all as a controlled substance.
Right. And it still is now.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a Schedule I controlled substance, the same as heroin and LSD.
But you said for 20 years you were in the wilderness, and we came out of the wilderness, and more and more states are moving in this direction. But then you've got Jeff Sessions, who's a real retrograde on this issue, who wants to go back to...
Absolutely. But it's interesting...
Even going after Oregon and Colorado and other states.
But there's so much public support. Surveys show that about almost 2/3 of the adult population favors the adult use of marijuana. Medical marijuana is off the charts. It's like the 4th of July, my pollster told me. And there was such a backlash, especially when Trump had stated in an interview in Colorado in October of 2016 that the states could go their own way, that even Trump was forced to clarify. And frankly, if he Sessions cracks down, I think that will accelerate the progress even faster because the American public aren't going to stand for it.
Yeah. I was checking here and I can't find it, but I did read this morning that Mayor de Blasio in New York has ordered the police to stop arresting people for smoking pot on the street.
Well, it is.
And so far as I know, recreational use of marijuana is not legal in New York State.
It is not legal in New York
so
State.
He's telling him
but as a practical matter, what they found is that they were still arresting thousands of people a month for something that most people now think should be legal, and the arrests were wildly disproportionate. 83% were people of color, and it was so outrageous that
I saw that. It was 8-1.
Yeah,
The
prosecutors there have backed down. They're not going to prosecute. Even Cynthia Nixon torturing Cuomo to come out in favor of legalization. I think New York is going to be one of the next states to fall.
Yeah. Well, good work. You've been pushing that and working in the wilderness for a long time, and it's finally paying off. And I think people are seeing this. I heard someone again the other day say how appalled she was that this was moving because it's the gateway drug. Some people still call it the gateway drug. Never proven true. Right?
It's not true. It is not true at all. In fact, having a vast black market makes it more likely that particularly young people will be introduced to something else because no corner drug dealer checks ID and is more likely to say, well, kid, you like this? I've got something. So we want to regulate it, tax it, and move on.
Congressman Earl Blumenauer representing Oregon's 3rd congressional district. Everybody thought that it was a done deal. We were going to have one big bipartisan farm deal, and suddenly last week, the Freedom Caucus rises up and kills it. What happened? How was it a good bill to start with?
It was a terrible bill.
All right.
The Farm Bill, and we've talked a little bit about this because you know well, coming from California, the Farm Bill is the most important bill that nobody pays any attention to. It will be the most important health bill that will be considered by this Congress. We're still subsidizing a diet that makes Americans sick. It's the most important environmental bill. The carbon emissions from the agricultural sector, the problems with water pollution, air pollution. And I've been having a lot of fun the last 3 years looking at what a farm bill would look like for the rest of us, not a handful of states producing a handful of commodity products. California and Oregon are cheated by the Farm Bill. We produce food, fruits, vegetables, nuts, berries, wine. And it is ill-served by the Farm Bill. I put in your hands a little guide. We call it the Fight for Food.
Fight for Food.
Which is available at earlblumenauer.com, where my campaign published it because it's an advocacy notebook. How to make a better farm bill and why.
And what a farm bill should look like and what it should contain.
Well, this was a fascinating dynamic. The Republicans determined that they were going to continue their war on poor people by cranking down on nutrition assistance, make it more bureaucratic, work requirements, and basically hound people off. It was so bad that it united all the Democrats on the Ag Committee, and every single Democrat voted against it. And there was a split. Part of it was 7 people in the Freedom Caucus voted no, but there were also some moderates that voted no, in part because of their dissatisfaction with what was happening on immigration. And some of them, I think, their conscience was troubled by what they would do to poor people in nutrition. So there was enough votes to sink it. And it is a terrible bill. One provision that has gotten almost no attention is the so-called King Amendment, which would prohibit
Steve King,
our favorite, calves the size of watermelons. He had an amendment that would have essentially stripped away the opportunity for states to protect consumer, animal welfare, and environmental standards that were more strict than any other states. It would have just taken out issues that are important. States want to protect their fisheries. There are different fishing license requirements. Not under this bill. So it crashed and burned. We'll see what happens.
But it's interesting that certainly have never have thought of the Farm Bill with all these dimensions that you just pointed out. Maybe the most important public health bill, environmental bill, even go down the list, right? All contained under the aegis of a Farm Bill, right?
The Department of Agriculture is the only department in the federal government that can build a community from the ground up. There's housing, there's utilities, there's all sorts of programs, large and small, but they don't get scrutinized, and they tend to be tailored to special interests that take advantage of it. The famous nutrition professor at NYU, Marilyn Nussel, wrote an essay, it was in Politico a couple of years ago, called "The Farm Bill Drove Me Crazy." Mm-hmm. And she concluded when she realized she didn't really fully understand it, so she was going to do whatever a professor would do to learn something. She was going to teach a graduate course in it. And halfway through, she realized it was hopelessly complex, that it was designed for special interests who understood their provision for crop insurance, for some bizarre subsidy for sugar. Or
I was going to ask you about the subsidies that continue to exist that we, again, most of us don't know about. Dairy subsidies, sugar subsidies.
It's very elaborate. It's very elaborate. In fact, the direct payments were eliminated in the last Congress. It's supposed to be a reform, but it was replaced by an insurance program that was even more expensive. The crop insurance is heavily subsidized, tightly controlled by a handful of, in some instances, foreign interests, and it's possible for farmers to plant crops they know will fail because of the way that it is tailored. And of course, with interacting with the new tax bill, and their version of the Farm Bill would increase subsidies in those who'd qualify. There'll be all sorts of subsidy checks that are going to go to San Francisco, to Chicago, to New York, people who don't have any connection to the farm. Yet there isn't enough money for nutrition. There's not enough money for environmental programs for ordinary farmers and ranchers who want to be good stewards. It's an outrage.
This are we still subsidizing unhealthy foods?
Absolutely. In fact, I mentioned that essay. Mary Nussel had a very vivid example that if we had the American diet based on what we subsidize, the typical meal would be one huge corn fritter, because 78% is for corn and soy. You would have a hamburger the size of a $50. You would have a cup of milk, and you'd have 3 peas. But you would have a great big linen napkin, because 13% of the subsidies goes to cotton.
What, under the Farm Bill?
Yep.
That is amazing. People, you know what? The ignorance about the Farm Bill among the American people.
Well, that's why we publish
profound.
That's why we publish this illustrated guide. The Fight for Food.
EarlBlumenauer.com. You can pick one up, right? Yeah.
And to be able to explain to people in more simple terms what's at stake and what they can do about it. But you know, I invite people to look at that monstrosity that the Republicans offered up, cutting money for farmers markets, one of the most popular programs in the country.
Yeah, they've just taken off. Right. This was also a priority for Paul Ryan, right? I mean, his fingerprints were on it. So just as an aside, what does it mean now about this lame duck's ability to deliver?
Well, you know, he can't even fire the chaplain. Going out with the bang.
Oh, yeah, right.
Oh, I saw a great cartoon with Father Conroy and Paul Ryan, and Ryan saying, "It's all right, Padre. We already sold our soul."
Wow. Yeah. That was an embarrassing moment, wasn't it? I mean,
but Paul used to be supporting farm reform. In fact, we offered up amendments in the past to cut back on unjustified farm subsidies. Yet his Agriculture Committee is coming up with a bill that explodes the subsidies, allows more people unrelated to farm to collect it, does not rein in the expensive crop insurance, which is a wild benefit for some, and doesn't benefit most farmers and ranchers. I don't know if he sold his soul, but he certainly gave up on farm reform.
Right. Yeah. But clearly showed that he his ability to deliver, given his present status, I guess, has suffered at any rate. Right. You've also been active out there. We talked a little bit before with the Department of Defense, getting a pretty big, what? I wouldn't say favor, but you back them down on
well, there have been efforts,
providing some information.
There's been efforts in the past to try and at least have transparency. I am appalled that at a time when we're not adequately taking care of our veterans, and when part of the military is hollowed out, and we get examples of this all the time, we're committed to $1.2 trillion of more investment in new nuclear weapons in the future. One of the things we've tried to do, and this is something that's bipartisan. For example, I've had an amendment with Representative Norman from South Carolina, who took Mick Mulvaney's spot.
Oh, yeah.
For an amendment to have transparency on the cost of the B-21 bomber. This is the new bomber.
This is the new, right?
It's going to replace
stealth bomber.
The B-1, B-2. It's stealth. Well, it's stealth is the price tag. We saw in the B-2.
Did you ferret it out? Are you getting?
Well, we have an amendment that will be considered this week on the defense authorization that would require the American people to know the price tag, and more important, for Congress to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean that's only fair, right? We got to know.
You'd think.
You would think, right? What these things. Have we known in the past?
Well, it's been very hard to get good estimates on weapons systems. They're notoriously inaccurate. There was an article this last week about the Nimitz class. The new ship that is been wildly over budget. It's going to be several years away. It's not operational yet, and I will just say that Mac Thornberry, to his credit, who's the lead Republican.
I've got to interrupt you there because you hear that music. That just means we are run out of time. Yeah, indeed. But look, from bikes to pot to defense to the Farm Bill, Earl Blumenauer is on top of it. EarlBlumenauer.com. Get your copy of this little booklet. Thank you, Congressman.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Raynard Sanders, Eric Schickler, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.